Hello, my friends. Welcome. My name is Shay Marville. I am an entrepreneur, a business and meditation coach, and a mom. And like you, I'm going through the wildness of this once-in-a-century pandemic that has changed everything. I want this space to be a place where we have conversations about the good things, the hard things, the sad things, and the sorrow, the triumphs, and the resilience. May this moment in our collective history be a catalyst for compassion, inclusion, better thinking, adaptation, and well-being. My friends, let's talk. Hello, my friends. Welcome to Let's Talk. I am elated today to have Professor Andrea O'Reilly in the pod for a conversation. She is a professor at the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at York University. She's the founder and director of the Motherhood Initiative, founder and editor of the Journal of Motherhood Initiative, and publisher of Demeter Press. And she was one of my professors over 20 years ago. She was dynamic and exciting to watch in the classroom. Her classes were an event. Andrea, welcome to Let's Talk. So let's talk. Did you always want to teach and write, or did you want to write and then teaching was a way to do that?
That's a very good question. Interestingly, when I was much younger, I'm talking, elementary school age, I actually wanted to be a writer, right? To write literature, fiction. And I wrote a lot as a youngster, nothing that probably was any good, but I wrote poetry and I wrote sort of creative nonfiction. I kept a diary, my whole adolescence. And I imagined myself as a writer. And then the saying goes that you do a PhD in English, that often kills the writer within you, the creative writer, because
Really?
Well, I think English, I think two reasons. I always joke, I did my dissertation on Toni Morrison. Well, if any writer is going to humble you, it's going to be her. Like, why try writing? I'll never be Toni Morrison, right? So it is. So when you make a living by reading, I read.
Yes.
I probably read 100 to 200 books a year.
Yes.
And I read the best. So it is a very humbling experience. Now, it shouldn't be. You should be able to say, in fact, all the studies say the more you read, the better a writer you are. In fact, most writers who give writing workshops or advice, the first thing they say is read.
Yes.
Right? Read and read and read across genres, like read popular fiction, read detective fiction, read literary fiction, read memoir, because the more you read, the better writer you become. So I think it's made me a better writer, but not a creative writer. I never went down that path, but I think my writing, even though it's not not literature, I still think it's creative. So when I write, I speak from, the I bring in personal experiences. I love language. I'm very attentive to language when I write, even though it's not fiction. So, I often say I'm not a writer, and then people say, well, you are a writer. You just write in that genre, not in fiction genre.
Yes, I've always thought of you as a writer. And, I think one of the most impressive things about you to me, when I was doing my second degree in literature, and you were my professor in a couple of different courses. And I'm glad you brought up the Toni Morrison piece, because I found you really sort of radical, not in what you were saying, but in the way that you, as a woman who is white, talked about Black mothering without any kind of, I'm apologizing. No, you just shared it from your experience.
Mm-hmm.
I found that radical.
Yeah, and that's
I loved it. I love that about your teaching.
Yeah, that's a really good point. When I started my work on Toni Morrison, I wouldn't say pushback, but raised eyebrows or maybe, questions about why, a white woman was doing Toni Morrison. But I always turned it back to Toni Morrison. She's always said, I'm a writer. Yes, I'm a
Yes,
Black writer, but don't just read me as Black writer. That's insulting, right? And that's
exactly.
how she was so read. I mean, in her earlier years, so positioned as a writer on the African American experience. No, she's a writer of the human experience that just happens to
Yes.
be African Americans in that human experience, right? So, in my, not so much later, but in my early years, people would say, do you have a right to do that as a white woman? And I was always very careful to say I can't speak for Black women, and
Hmm.
nor do I don't think a Black woman can speak for Black women either because of
That's
the many
right.
differences across and in race, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
but I take it seriously, both writing, but also what she's writing about. And in my work, I then from her work, I developed. Well, I shouldn't say it really much influenced my thinking on mothering. Though I'm a
Yes.
white woman, I think the lessons that we can take from somebody like Toni Morrison or Patricia Collins or Bell Hooks, among many others, is a really radical, affirming, transgressive, empowering view of mothering. And we have a lot to
Yes.
learn from that. So we don't
Yes.
co-opt it and appropriate it and say, okay, I'm going to do it. No, but we can learn from that. So I remember when I read Toni Morrison, as a mother, I thought, I remember she once said, mothering, is the most important thing that ever happened to me. And I thought that is so radical because white feminists are always saying, oh, motherhood oppresses me and motherhood makes me downtrodden and mothering holds me back. And Toni Morrison emphatically has said, mothering made me a better person and made me a better writer. And
Hmm.
that is really different. So I took from
Right.
that, I actually read, her thinking on mothering resonated more with my experience at the time than
Hmm.
what white women were writing about. Right.
Hmm. Hmm.
Obviously her experiences were hugely different as a Black woman, but the larger meanings that
Yeah.
she said about mothering resonated more for me than at the time. Now, white feminism has changed drastically since that was in the mid to late 90s, where
Right.
it was largely motherhood's this oppressive institution. I got to get out of it. I hate, this. And I thought, well, yeah, that's all true too. Motherhood is oppressive as an institution, but it can be wildly empowering as an experience, right? So I think that's, what I think. Well, Toni Morrison's a gifted writer anyway, beyond all of that, obviously. But I really think, she is very much a social commentator, right? And
Right.
obviously she was, because she also wrote many, many nonfiction books and was interviewed widely, right? About political
Completely.
social issues, not just about
Yes.
literary issues, right?
Yep, she was a great observer and witness to the social experiment of race and also being a woman and just living as a human being. And the thing, and I'm not trying to butter you up. I've known you for 2 decades now, but I
Two
just
decades plus, I think.
2 decades plus. I just have always admired the tenacity and courageous way you talked about hard things to students
Mhm.
in a classroom. So that 3 hour lecture or 2 hour lecture, I can't believe that we used to do that in person.
Yeah, I know.
What was kind of like a performance as well.
Mhm.
Like it was an experience to go to the class, and that sort of motivated you to get more deeply into the work. Do you think do you still teach that way? Do you still bring that to?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I try to, but it is true that with teaching, a couple things. I think anything you do. I started teaching in 1985, so my good, I've been teaching for a long, long time, right? And normally you'd be, kind of retired by now. But
Yes, right.
in academe, I started teaching as a graduate student, and I was all of 23 years old. So we have kind of these long careers, right?
Yes,
We're not like a teacher that after 25 years, you're burnt out and it's time to exit. Not for all, but for many. And I
right.
think because of academe, you teach, 10 years as a grad student, then as a contract faculty, then you finally get tenure. So, yeah, you could be teaching for 40 years as an academic, if as a professor, if not more. So I do think it is hard to retain that passion and energy and commitment. So sometimes I think I'm faltering and I worry, but then again, I hear from students and, a lot of the stuff I keep talking about the same stuff, not that I'm lazy, these stuff is important. So I still talk about age and rich.
Yes.
And, so I've been talking about age and rich for 30 years. Sometimes I say, if I have to say one more time, but then my son always tells me, but Mom, it's new to them. You've got to remember that. You're thinking, oh gosh, I could do this,
my eyes closed.
And I think you do get the energy from students. Now, as you said earlier, that is really changing. Certainly with this year, with the pandemic, it's really hard because I think students don't realize that teaching is very reciprocal. So when I'm teaching, if my students are engaged and nodding and pondering and, furrowed brows or what have you, then I get more engaged, right? It is very much this, symbiotic relationship. And that's very hard to replicate in large lecture halls. And it's I think, impossible to replicate remotely. So, but I still love it. And I always change things. I design new courses. I've just recently designed a new course on young mothers. I did one a few years ago on bad mothers in literature. I can't explain it. Something gets stuck in my brain and I just got to work with it and figure it out. That way it keeps me engaged and passionate because I haven't figured it out. So it's new to me.
That's it. What you just said right there, that to me was a thing that I felt like I enjoyed and became like a jumping off point for some of the research that I went on to do at the Ontario Science Centre.
Right.
Some of that actually got stimulated for me in your classes because you would say, I don't know what the answer is. Yeah. I'm just kind of exploring the text, the material, and then, looking and then rereading. And that's why it never really gets tired. Do you think that you created the publishing house because you were trying to extend that process? Why did you create Demeter?
Well, as I always seem to do, I go back to Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison once, when off quoted, she said, I wrote the books I needed to read, right? And I created a press to publish the books that I and others need to read because, I've been working in this field now over 30 years, and let's just say it's been an uphill battle to give legitimacy to motherhood studies, to see it as valuable, to see it as scholarly, to see it as worthwhile. And I know that many of the books that Demeter has published would never have been published by mainstream press because it's often considered a niche market or it wouldn't generate enough money. So we've published books like on Muslim mothering and disabled mothering and Indigenous mothering and mad mothers and incarcerated mothers. I don't think they would be published. Now they're well read, they're used in courses. They're, certainly libraries buy them. People read them, our books sell. I mean, they're not bestsellers, but that's not why we're doing it, right? Of course, we always have the financial realities that this year is Demeter's 15th anniversary. How we've kept going, I honestly do not know. We have very little grant. We get a tiny, tiny grant of $20,000 a year, and it costs us about $12,000 to apply for it because we have accounting paperwork.
Yes,
about $9,000. But I just really believe that it's going to work out. I mean, there's many days I've locked the door and sat there. But I don't know. My advice has always been, and I'm privileged, I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm able-bodied, I have another job, that pays my bills, so I can take these risks in a way that perhaps others can't. But I don't know what's the worst thing going to happen.
Yeah.
Right? And I always say, my philosophy is, you don't ask for permission, you beg for forgiveness, right? And I really believe you just do something.
Yes.
And just do it. And it's scary and risky and there's certainly could be consequences. And
why why is motherhood such an important location for research and learning? Why isn't it like, well, everyone, you're a mother, and people do it differently, and that's just how it goes. Like,
Right.
but why is that a location for, like, it's just like what you've been doing over the last 15 years with the publishing house. You just keep growing and bringing more people to the table talking about motherhood. Like the walls are being pushed
Yes.
out, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, part of it is that, central to my work in Demeter is how we use the word mothering. We do not limit it to identity. So mother, I always argue, is better understood as a verb. It's something someone does. So it's open to trans, non-binary, it's open to men, it's open, to various modes of that mothering practice. And I think that's what we really insist on, that we really want to challenge that normative motherhood that says only certain women can be mothers or good mothers in this certain way by these certain rules and so part of it is I really want to challenge that really static, prescriptive, limiting, restrictive definition of the mother. So we use mothers, we use mothering. Now it's hard, it's contested, it's difficult, right? Because even today's climate, even the word mother now is under review, right? And for good reasons. Trans, and I'm currently just finished an article on this, and understandably, trans and binary people feel excluded by the term mother, understandably and agreeably. But I'm also arguing you can't erase the mother either, because the consequences are dire, right? You erase or ignore the importance of mothering for Black and Indigenous mothers. It's not parenting that's important for these; it's mothering. So how do you hold that in one hand and say, yes, we have to use mother sometimes, but also we have to recognize that that term can be very exclusionary.
Right.
So I'm really in my work, I'm really struggling, and I just finished the piece yesterday. And I haven't slept much in the last few weeks. How do you, include without exclude?
Right.
So this is sort of the new. So every time we do motherhood studies, there was, in the early years, the challenge or the fight was to prove it was worthy of scholarship. My goodness, when I designed my motherhood course years ago, in the late 80s, early 90s, I mean, the pushback I got was just. Today we would be shocked, but people say, why are you doing a course on mothering? Are you going to teach mothers how to change nappies? I mean, it was just, they could not even understand that mothering was a place to be, something to be studied. And I said, my heavens, you teach courses on war. You don't teach somebody how to load a gun, right? We're talking.
Oh my God, this is so
mothering as an institution.
But and that's why I say it was radical in the early 90s. Excuse me, because I remember like people saying, well, why would you take a course on mothering? And like, what is there to learn? And there was what wasn't there to learn?
Yeah, exactly. No, I know I found it very offensive and insulting. I mean, as I said, Demeter has published, 160 books with about 30 in the pipeline. And years ago, I applied for a grant, and I was turned down because they said it was a niche market and we'd run out of things to talk about that was actually written. And I thought, would you say that about anything else? Right? I mean, even authors that are dead, nobody says you can't talk about Shakespeare anymore. I mean, you can keep talking about anything. And then initially I kind of panicked and thought, oh dear, maybe they're right. And now I'm like, no, careful what you wish for, because I'm constantly getting proposals and ideas. And also Demeter has really opened up its mandate to include family and sexuality.
Yes.
So, excitedly, we have out today a call for papers on Black persons and COVID-19, right? Because we've just so the call for papers will be circulated this afternoon. And as you know, I published that huge book on mothers and COVID, which was, 540 pages, 45 chapters, and 70 contributors. So there's so much still to say, right?
Yes.
So it's not like, so when we did the COVID book on mothering, then somebody saw that and thought, well, yes, and we know why we need a book on mothering, because they've been mothers more than fathers have been hit by this
Right.
because of the gendered work we do in our homes.
Yep.
But the literature is also saying that racialized persons have been hugely disproportionately hit by COVID. So we need a book. And so we now have a book, right? So,
well, and it's also, it's not just the need for the book, it's the capturing of the experience right now before we forget it, or before we start to politicize, or, try to add certain categories to it after it has happened.
Absolutely. Yeah. Right? I mean, it's hard to write in the moment, because I remember when I did the call for papers for mothers in the pandemic, and the irony was not lost on me. It was about how mothers are completely overwhelmed, exhausted. And I'm asking those same mothers to write about that, right? Because obviously don't have the time to write about that. So I had so many inquiries and said, I would love to submit a chapter, but the theme is actually what's preventing me from doing so. But nonetheless, we got more than 100 abstract submissions, more than any Demeter book. It was so obvious. There was just an urgent, if not desperate, need for mothers to have to tell their stories, and for them to be taken seriously and listened to of their experiences of the pandemic. So, and I think you're so right. We have to do it now, because after the fact, we see things differently. We got to write it in the moment. And then this will be used later. I mean, it's not limited to COVID. COVID is exposing things that were pre-existent.
Precisely.
And that's why I think, not that we wanted this pandemic by any means, but I think finally people are talking about the inequities of, gendered labor in the home. I mean, academics have always been doing that, but now it's being talked about by everyday people, right? Yes. Because COVID has exposed those inequities, just like it has exposed emphatically inequities with race. I mean, we knew they were there, but my goodness, we can't turn away now. We cannot. No. And that's what COVID has done. It has forced us to look.
Yeah.
We don't like what we're seeing, but now's the time to say, okay, what are we seeing? What caused this? And what can we do about it? Not just limited to COVID. Take these lessons from COVID. And I think I'm hoping that it is going to be a transformative moment in our society for real social change across all sectors, care of our elderly, racial disparities, gender inequities. There's a neon light now flashing. You can't turn off or dim anymore. So I think, that was part of why that's why we did the COVID book, and now why we're doing the second book on Black experiences of COVID, but globally. And we'll see what happens. I don't know. The book.
You'll see what it looks like, and is it different, or what's different about it, and what the experiences are. There's like 1,000 things bubbling in my mind right now with you, but one of the things is I think we're also coming up with new solutions. Like we've sort of reorganized our family in terms of how we operate. So there's a kind of a democratization in some ways, because the kids are going to school from home. Joe and I are working from home, built a studio in the home, built media rooms in the home, all these things. But there's also the kids seeing us work.
Yes.
And seeing what our work involves.
Yes.
In a way that they would not have seen before. And then there's negotiating around housework and time, and who has leisure time and who does not. And there are conversations, I think, that we are having with our teenagers right now that we did not have in 2018 or 2019.
No, and in fact, that came up continuously in the Mothers in COVID book. I mean, you don't want to ever say there's, a silver lining to this pandemic, because the costs have been too high. But people are saying, in my research, I have and it's not my own, but I've developed a sort of theory that whenever there's been a sort of a cataclysmic overhaul in our society, economic, social, cultural, that motherhood is transformed in response and as a result of. it's sort of, a lecture I do every year. And I walk my students through history. And I argue that there's been sort of four moments, right? I mean, I won't repeat all of that, but one was after, industrialization. Because of industrialization, mothering was radically transformed as it had been in a rural economy. Then after the war, it was radically redefined in the late 40s because of transition from a war economy to a peace economy. Then another time was in the 90s with the rise of neoliberalism. We started seeing this intensive mothering. I say all this because I wonder if this is going to be another one of those moments. This has been a huge cataclysmic economic, social, cultural upheaval. Will mothering change as a response? And will it change in terms of perhaps more recognition of mothering? Because now we're talking about it, we're seeing it. It's not hidden away in a private sphere somewhere. Is it going to change because more partners now are negotiating more equitable parenting arrangements? Yes. Is it going to change because children are now seeing the work of mothering? I wonder, and I do think that this is a moment that is going to resonate. I always say, PhDs are going to be writing on this long after we're all dead, right?
Agreed.
And so I'm wondering, it's too early to tell, but I'm wondering that mothering, well, lots of things are going to change, but my work is mothering. I wonder, out of all of this, motherhood's going to be transformed yet again, and hopefully in a better way. And I think it might.
I agree with you. Because you go ahead.
No, I was just saying, because what you're saying, the negotiations you're having with your partner, we're seeing that. And one thing that came out in the book too, and I also, and in the art chapter I included, and others, is that a lot of women are in frontline work. They're nurses and they're doctors, or they're in, or they're PSWs. So they're out in the public sphere. And what's happening is a lot of male partners are now at home because their work can go, whatever, whatever they're doing. They're tech guys or accountant guys or whatever. And the women have left for 12-hour shifts. They're gone. Right. So what are these male parents now doing? Well, they're doing mothering. They're doing and so they're the ones over. Now that's, they're not the exception. I mean, they're not the majority, but a lot of fathers have become the de facto at-home parent because of the high numbers of women who traditionally are in those professions, nursing, social work, PSW work. Those things can't be done at home. So I think a lot of fathers are now mothering. They're at home overseeing their kids learning. They're making dinner. They're cleaning the house. They're doing the maternal thinking that Ruddock talks about. They're remembering, the organizing, the planning. So that's interesting. I would love, and I think it's going to happen. See, future research to interview those couples where the woman did exit. What happened in those homes? Right?
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens to the marriage. And what happens and what behaviors are modeled to the children. I mean, as you know, my mom passed away as a result of COVID in July. And I had a very powerful human mother who was my single parent. She was a divorced person with 4 kids and raised us in Canada. And we came here in 1974. She was a person who was a nurse and midwife, and she made her own money. She created a kind of a middle class, working class to middle class life for us, for me. And I find, in her death, in the grief, and grief, as I've said to you, has many rooms. But one of the things that I think a lot about, like obsessively, is just how she was so capable of doing so many things so effectively. And I think it was because she did an analysis of her environment, what she was living in. And she said, this is what I have. This is how I manage what I have economically. And this is how much I can do. And then she started to work with, she was very economical about things and efficient. And I'm not suggesting my mother's perfect or anything like that. I'm just saying that I find myself thinking a lot about how she had so much structure to how she parented. And that actually allowed for me to be this person who is more bohemian and
Yeah.
wants to be innovative and be an entrepreneur and try all sorts of things. But it was because in many ways she actually had created this foundation that was independent of a marriage and a
Mm-hmm.
partner.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
it fascinates me now. I never really fully thought about it when she was
No.
living.
How for her time,
Yes. Yeah.
and to be, not just to do it, but to do it so successfully when everybody around you,
Yes.
as a single Black woman, saying, you're by definition bad, incompetent, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And to defy and transcend and push back, or even more, to those stereotypes is, yeah, it's huge.
Yes.
And I think we often are, children are so myopic. I have 3 of them. I was one once, but it's really hard to see, because we're trained to see only our mothers as our mothers, right?
Yes.
But that's part of motherhood studies. We have to say, and I often, when I teach my motherhood course, I used to say to my students, who would be young adults, anywhere from 18 to 21, I would ask them, about, I don't do it now. I'm in a large lecture hall format, unfortunately. But when I was in smaller seminars, I used to say, tell me about your mother. And so many people don't even think their mother existed before they did, right? They have no concept of their mother's life, right? As a person, either before becoming a mother or outside of motherhood. Yes. Mothers are human, and we make mistakes just like any other human, but the standards for motherhood are higher than for humans, right? So, because we romanticize it, we naturalize it, and children can be pretty, and I'm not blaming the children, the culture feeds that and sustains that and reinforces that. So, children think that so if their mother makes a mistake, a normal mistake, they're suddenly a bad mother, because the standards of motherhood are so impossible, particularly today. I mean, when I had my children, raised them in the 80s and 90s, before the rise of what I call, well, not just me, but what's called intensive mothering, that, that hyper vigilant, child-centered, children speaks 3 languages by the age of 1, plays a violin by 3, that doesn't come into being to the mid to late 90s in a substantive way. Thankfully, I raised my children just as it was gaining momentum. So that's another thing what happened in early COVID that the mothers talk about. They just said, the saying was, well, Shakespeare wrote King Lear during the pandemic and the Renaissance, right? What's wrong with you mothers, right? How come you're not using this opportunity for enrichment and stimulation for your children? And the mothers were so enraged, they're hanging on, right? And suddenly now they're being told this is the moment, right? For and mothers in the early months of the pandemic, I mean, so many mothers were just saying, I've had enough. Like, we're barely functioning here. Yes. And you're now saying I'm supposed to be this ultimate intensive mothering who's going to use every opportunity and every moment to enrich my child. I think that ended pretty quick. I think most people realized, certainly by July, that we were all hanging on by our fingertips, right? And I was interviewed earlier for the National Post on mothers and COVID, and one thing that just kept coming up is that this isn't normal, right? The way we're living, but we're acting like it is normal. There's this really kind of cognitive dissonance, like we're going on with our lives in this kind of weird space. And nobody's really saying it's, yes, we are sort of, but not in a way. So all these mothers are doing this and they're really beating themselves up. Others are judging them. We have to just stop for a moment and say, this is not normal. Right?
See, okay. So this is good, because I don't know if you noticed this. I mean, we're now in this, we really are in the fatigue part of this pandemic. Like we know the vaccine's there, it's coming, but a lot of people are like suffering from a kind of mild depression or more. But there's this perfectionism that a lot of mothers and women have about how you should mother. And, even in this pandemic, I feel like a lot of mothers is just so much pressure so much pressure, and then on Facebook and Instagram, like showing all these pictures of this, the dinners and all these nice things that people are doing. And I worry about people because how is it possible, to be, obviously I do a lot of motivational stuff, but I also share a lot about what doesn't work.
Yeah.
But I feel like a lot of people are just in this perfectionism mode that could be so dangerous.
It is. And I think, again, and I think that's why, the saying, but speak truth to power and to speak truthfully. I mean, I guess that's been always to be authentic and to, it's the only way we're going to disrupt these master narratives, to quote Toni Morrison once again, right? You gotta, and that's, as you know, I created that Mothers in COVID page, the Facebook group. And, within 24 hours, like 300 people had joined. And it's like, I mean, it's not really as active anymore, but it's still a place where somebody can say, I'm really having a bad day here. And everybody can say, that's normal. That's okay. Anything I can do, this worked for me, but I'm not judging. It's just maybe some advice. Mothers need more than ever a safe space to vent, to rant, to be validated, to be acknowledged. And so I think that's what we did with this book. I hope the Mothers in COVID book was to create that safe space, right? But to invite other people into that space, right? Without judgment.
Yes, without judgment.
Or censor or blame, right? But yeah, I think a lot of mothers, I don't know, I'm speaking generally, but I do think, there's been sort of, again, waves of this pandemic. And again, that's retrospectively, we're going to see that, right? I think in the early, months, we were trying to make the best of it. And if I saw one more, picture of a baked, bread loaf, I would have stuck pins in my eyes, right? So that it was kind of like, oh, we can bake or we can do crafts. And, that lasted for about 2 or 3 months, right? And I'm not judging people. Like, that's what you had to do, right?
Yes.
Fun. This is different. I think right now, as you say, we're in fatigue right now. We are just hanging on.
Yes.
And I think it's exhaustion now and despair and disillusionment that is kind and just almost as monotone. I can't explain it. Like, there's been some articles now that people aren't even reaching out anymore because they're just so tired of it,
they're
right?
Tired.
The Zoom and the chats, and they're like, yes, that was important in the early months and it still matters. But I think people are really turning inward now, much more than they did in the early months of the pandemic. And that's not a bad thing either, if it's a temporary liminal space, as they call it, of growth and reflection. But it's also can be a very depressive space. Right?
Sure. And I think, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say a lot of people seriously, mental health is.
Oh, it's the pandemic within the pandemic is the mental health and the mental suffering so many people are experiencing, which they might have had prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic has just kind of driven, the whole thing into a kind of hyper mode. But I'm also wondering, are you thinking about older moms and, what's happening with women who are mothers and they're in their 70s and their 80s and 90s who are feeling so isolated?
Yes.
That's another piece.
That didn't really come up in our book except indirectly, like some mothers were talking about their mothers, right? Most of the submissions for this book were about mothers of children, right? Being kind of, but, they were older children too. We had mothers talking about teenagers and, young adults. But we didn't have them, and I wish we had. That we do have a book coming out in October on grandmothers and grandmothering. So I imagine there'll be some COVID stuff in that. You can't publish anything now without at least a reference to this, right? All these poor authors are now having to go back and update their books, right? Because you can't talk about these themes now without at least some reference to what's happening, right? And I know we've had a couple books published, and the author, just about publishing, the author's like, well, hold on, can I have another week? I want to kind of contextualize it with what's happening now. But I do know that came up in the book that daughters are doing mother work for their mothers, and that has been another shift right? We talk about the first shift, which is paid labor, the second shift, I call, domestic labor. I call the third shift kind of that, the remembering, the planning, the creation of home, right? To create meaning and to care. And the fourth shift has been called homeschooling now. And the fifth shift, I think, is elder care, right, in the pandemic.
Yes.
That mothers are doing, and we know it falls on daughters more than sons. The evidence is there. So daughters as mothers are now doing care work for their mothers. They're doing all their grocery shopping. They're making all their appointments. They're doing all that. I mean, they used to do it before the pandemic, perhaps, but doing it way more now because their elder parents cannot leave the house.
That's right.
It's unsafe.
Yes.
So they're doing all this work on top of these other four shifts, right? Yeah. And that did come up a fair bit in the Mothers in COVID book. That's, women were talking about, elder care has just, magnified, not just in work, but in worry, right?
And then also all these women who are the caregivers, the PSWs and the healthcare aides within these retirement and elder or like long-term care communities. They are predominantly women.
They are overwhelmingly women, yes.
And so, one of the things that I'm hearing a lot about are women who are nurses deciding that they are retiring because taking early retirement because they cannot, one, put their family at risk. Two, the amount of work they are managing for their elderly parents and their children, it's no longer doable. Like they just physically, they do not have the resource. So they're making very dire economic decisions. Then you have some mothers who are nurses and PSWs who actually are living separately from their families so that they can continue to work, provide the money, but they're not seeing them because they can't take on the risk. And then I think so many women, I was with a group yesterday of nurses coaching, they just are completely depleted. They're completely depleted and there's no support from the workplace or from the family place, because for a long time, they've been the go-to person. They've been the go-to person. And they they were the one managing the whole ecosystem. And now it's unmanageable.
And again, what is long-term care, good consequence of this, I mean,
yes.
These wounds in our psyche and body are there. Right. They don't just disappear when the cause disappears. Right. I think people are going to be carrying this around, particularly people who are on the front line. Right. The stress, the anxiety, the worry, the burnout, the exhaustion, the fear. They're on automatic pilot right now. It's adrenaline. But once that ends, right. Yes. Or at least decreases. It's going to be. And the point you made earlier, again, which came up in the book, and certainly we're seeing it in the news, is that the impact of this for women, most people are saying it's going to be a minimum of 5 to 10 years to get women back to where they were before the pandemic, right? In the book, there's so many chapters about women, who have had to leave their jobs. They just can't do 2 jobs at home. It's impossible. I remember I was talking to somebody early in the pandemic and they said, I don't see what the issue is. The woman's at home working 7 hours, let's say she's a secretary or she's an accountant. I don't know what she does. And there's children there. So what's the problem? And I said, you clearly have never been around children, right? Children, they need to, never mind fed, clothed, bathed. They need to not kill each other, right? Yes. Like children, they don't just exist. Children, I had 3 born in 5 years. They scrap, they fight, they're bored, they act out, and these are good kids.
Yes,
the kids just don't sit like a plant on a counter. But these people thought they did. They honestly could not understand why a woman couldn't sit in front of a computer for 8 hours a day with her children in her home. Yes, she might have to get up and maybe feed them at noon. No, children demand our attention. And anybody who would say otherwise has never been around children. Yeah, they can abuse each other. Maybe you're lucky for never mind even real young ones like babies and toddlers and preschoolers. they need for their very survival our attention, right? You can't just say to a baby, okay, I'll see you in 8 hours. No, they'll die. They could die. They're not fed. They've soiled diapers. We know that. So I think I think the pandemic has shown that mothering is work. That's why I use the term mother work more than mothering, because it is labor, and it's intellectual labor, it's skilled labor, and it's hard labor. It's both, it's both white collar and blue collar labor. And women are leaving in huge numbers. We talk about this in the book. This is being called a she recession, not a recession. It's the only recession in recorded history that has hit women more than men. In the past, they've either hit men more, like the 2008 recession, or they've hit both genders more or less equally. This is a she recession. It's women who are being hit. Their jobs are disappearing because they're in retail or they're in service work. Those jobs are gone, or they're come and go, depending on what stage we are in lockdown. Or those women are leaving their jobs because they have no choice, or they're reducing their hours. Or they're not doing a project, and then they're not getting that promotion.
Right.
So most people are saying that this is going to impact women's work, their employment, their retirement income.
Yes.
It's once this is over, women, it's going to take them many, many years to get back pre-pandemic.
Do you think
in terms of their financial security, in terms of their employment positioning?
Right.
Another study came out of Australia, and I'm going to research it more for North America. But for the book, I talked about this article that revealed that in Australia, the number of women at universities is hugely down. And interestingly, the age which they're dropping, not so much young, but between 25 and 35. And guess what those years are? Women are mothers.
Yes, yeah.
And so those women are now not going to university. And so what does that mean for their future earnings? So the ripple effect is really terrifying.
I wonder if we're going to see the rise of the entrepreneurial mother, right? So you can't fit into the 9-to-5 job.
Right.
That position doesn't exist anymore. But you're the breadwinner. You're the lead breadwinner. What can you do? And is it creating a business? And if so, what kind of business, right? And I say that because, entrepreneurship for me has always been the way to make something, because I have found there's lots of gatekeepers, and I haven't always been great with gatekeepers, right? So I've found, a way to do something, do what I want, build a museum, create, I've always had crazy ideas. Is to do it myself, right? And to figure out how to do that. I know that for a lot of women, they don't like to take that risk. Yeah. But now the pandemic has said, the thing that you thought was your safety net does not exist anymore.
Yeah, and to realize that, to make it manifest, that's again in terms of policy, that would be, when we think about economic recovery, we're thinking in old patterns, right?
Yes.
Build a bridge. No, maybe build the bridge, but give those women money, startup loans, startup grants, right? Because for many women, they don't have the financial ability to start a business, right? They don't have the clout, the connections, or the financial resources. So,
Exactly.
So how do we do that? And one way, we really need to become creative how we're going to spend our way out of this. And one way, I really think you're absolutely right. Like, women have untapped skills, but they need a startup. They don't want to go further in debt because they're already in debt because of the pandemic.
Precisely.
Too scary and risky. So yes, who knows, out of this, we're seeing a reinvention of family maybe, and we're definitely going to see a reinvention of work. One blessing of this pandemic has been that we realize we can work from home. Not 5 days a week. I don't think anybody wants that. That's too isolating and alienating. But I know so many of my colleagues and friends and their kids, they were pleading to work from home. People in telecommunications, people who do IT. Yeah. They were driving to work, polluting our environment, congesting our roads for an hour each way on the commute for work that could be done at home. And guess what? They're all at home now. And guess what? The work's being done as well, if not better.
Yes. We've added an hour. We've added an hour, according to Harvard.
That's what they're saying. We're working more hours because we're working that commute. So we're getting up at 7 and starting work at 7:30. Well, before we would be working until 9 because we'd be dressing and we'd be getting in the car and we'd be driving, we'd be parking, getting our coffee en route. So I think that is going to be a bit of a blessing. Having said that, I know people who are working from home and they said, yes, working from home every day, maybe not. Maybe we go in, once a week or 2 days every 2 weeks. But that's going to change so many things. And I think in a better way, it's going to free up space in our cities. We're hopefully be converted to apartment units rather than these monstrosities of business spaces that we don't need now.
Yes.
So there's possibilities there if it's done correctly. Businesses aren't going to need that space.
No.
Pandemic. We all know that. So what do we do with that space? How do we use it for social good? But I really think that in terms of the environment and in terms of family, working from home has been an upside in many ways of the pandemic. If obviously the women, because it's women who do care work, have childcare as well. I mean, you can't just tell a woman to work home and say, but your kids are going to fall off the balcony. But that's another concern. They've talked about how many childcare centers have closed permanently in Toronto. What's going to happen after the pandemic? They're closed permanently. It takes a year or two to start up a childcare center. Yeah. So when women do return, there's not going to be, we already had a crisis in childcare.
Right.
Now there's not even spaces, even if you could afford them. So again, this adjustment post COVID is going to be, it's going to be hard, but I really hope there's some really smart, creative people at the table when we start thinking our way out of this.
Yes.
I fear there will not be.
Yeah, right? I think so many. Yeah, I think you're right. I think sometimes there's a lot of linear thinkers.
Yeah,
and they're not always good at imagining what innovation looks like.
Yeah,
but the thing is, the pandemic, we never could have envisioned this, right? Yes. And all these things that are being done now that we used to say absolutely not, never in a lifetime, now are possible. So I kind of feel like, I don't know. I think we can question a lot of things right now.
Yeah.
Tell me this, and I won't keep you. I know you're really busy and you're tired from, writing for a whole week every night. What do you think is next for you as a priority in terms of the studies around motherhood?
Oh, that's a good and hard one. I can answer that 6 different ways. For me, it is to keep, I know this sounds really kind of trite or obvious, but to keep it going. One business that has been hit really hard by the pandemic, well, we all have, but, publishing houses are, in crisis. Many publishers have closed permanently. Bookstores are closed. Now it's been a bit better in the United States the last 4 or 5 months, but in the UK, my goodness, there's bookstores that are gone forever. So part of it is, again, that's another thing about thinking our way out of this. I believe books are essential to humanness, right? Yes. And again, to make sure that in our recovery that we don't lose that piece, whether it's the arts or media or publishing, they are going to be part of the solution, but are they going to be around to do that? So in a very basic way, I think a lot of publishers are really terrified right now. Sales plummeted during the pandemic. Bookstores closed. We had thousands and thousands of books returned to us because bookstores literally closed and we have to accept them. Thousands and thousands of dollars we thought we had, but then were returned.
Yes.
And it isn't just my price. I think there's a lot, and with the transition to remote learning, people aren't buying books anymore, right? They're buying ebooks or they're using course kits, which is fine, but that isn't going to help publishers, right? You don't make money on ebooks or course kits. And I'm saying not about money, but about survival.
Yes, of course.
So we're managing only because we have hugely devoted readers that probably buy books that they don't plan to read, but they care about us. So I nag them too much. I say, "Okay, Andrew, I'm going to finally buy the book so you'll stop bothering me." That's a very practical concern. I think a lot of us, when we're envisioning how our businesses are going to look like post-pandemic, I think where we start is that real scary place of the practicals. When I include, obviously restaurants and that, and small business, front store, small businesses. But to keep it opened. I can't, if that makes any sense. Like I hope, let's say this, I hope I remain continuously surprised
Yes.
and
Yes.
engaged that, things come across my desk and I want to do a book on that. And I go, oh my goodness, I never thought about that we need a book on that. Right. So to always keep that newness, that energy, that almost maybe naivete, like, do we need this? Yeah, let's try. Like, I think you really got to, I always that expression, if you're on thin ice, you might as well dance. Um, I really hope that, Demeter and motherhood scholarship, we are starting to get legitimacy. It's still very, I talk about this in my book on matricentric feminism. We're still outside, right?
Yes.
Feminists are not talking about motherhood. We're still siloed. We're still marginalized. We're still not taken seriously. And, in the book, I talk about why and why that is and what we can do. I want more people to take seriously the work of mothering and to see it as important, skilled, necessary, respected, valued labor, that without it, the world we call culture would not be.
Right.
And I remember once I was having an argument, no, what's mother? And I often when I'm out and about, I look at adults and the things that we take for granted, they were taught.
Yes.
We all can tie our shoes because our mother taught us how to tie our shoes, right?
Yes, that's
we
right.
all know how to go to the bathroom properly because our mother taught us. And it may not be a cisgendered, but our primary caretaker taught us. The skills we take for granted, that's somebody's labor.
Yes.
And we don't do that with any other thing. We recognize when a building is built that somebody built that and all that skill went into it. And we applaud this beautiful building. We have, a celebration and an unveiling. When an adult is created, nobody understands that a labor created that human being with love. But the love's almost irrelevant. It was labor.
Yes.
That created that child to self-regulate and to, and to, all those things that make us human. So I guess for me, there's just, we're still having that argument or that discussion where people just do not, it's so invisibilized, mothering. It's so naturalized. It's so siloed. And I just, want a day where I don't have to have 20 minutes of explanation about why mothers matter. Well, I want to start much further down.
Well, I think your work and the body of work that you've created is going to contribute to that. And I think this moment in the pandemic, this catastrophe that we're all trying to live through, I think it's made it more apparent that mothering has labor, and that has nothing to do with love.
No.
It has
love makes it easier. Right?
Yeah, love makes it worthwhile until you have teenagers.
That's right.
They tell you about all the things that are wrong with you. Continually.
I know, but that's what my mother used to say. That's why the god or goddess gave us cute, adorable babies, because if we gave birth to teenagers, we'd never do it again. We kind of get drawn in with this,
with the cuteness.
But, and that's nothing but mothering. It's also different at every stage and with every child. Like the richness is unending, right?
Yes.
So you talk about mothering of a 2-month-old or a 2-year-old or a 12-year-old or an 18-year-old, 22-year-old or a 42-year-old is different.
Yes.
Mothering is a journey. Yes. And we have to, it's different. There isn't, how we mother a child at 2 is going to be very different, as as we'd mother them at 18 or 15. Yeah. And each child requires different mothering.
Precisely.
So that kind of, richness is so flatlined.
Yeah.
Right? In this, one size fit all, this just dismissive, mother, like as if one word could ever capture all of this.
Truly. And it's the cognitive intelligence, the diverse intelligence that you have to have over time to mother or parent another human being, like to recognize not just what they need to live, but what they need to actually be themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, it's challenging.
It's work. It's intellectual labor. It is. That's why I love Sarah Ruddock's work, because she talks about maternal thinking as a set of intellectual practices. Right?
Yes.
And it's something we have to learn as mothers. It's not innate.
No.
I so much insist that with my students. I didn't know anything when they passed me that baby at barely 23 years old. I didn't have a clue what I was going to do.
Yeah.
And I learned by doing. And that's why anybody can do it. It's not innate. You give a man a baby, a newborn, and walk away, he'll figure it out too, because he has to.
Right. Yeah. Well, Andrea, thank you
for being
you. On Let's Talk. I'm so grateful. I am continuously grateful that I had the great chance to walk into your classroom and to get to know you. And I hope that the publishing house continues to grow and flourish actually over the next little while as we move through this pandemic.
Well, thank you. And when you walked into my classroom, I don't think you were a mother yet, were you?
No, I was not. I was not a mother at all. Yeah.
And that's another thing. Thank you mentioning that, because it's not just about mothers that we have who need to hear this.
Yes, exactly.
Have these conversations, right? Everybody does.
Well, you know what? The kids, we were because my house is full of books. That's the most valuable thing I have, and we were clearing out one of the bookcases, and the kids were saying, well, do you need this book? And do you need that book? And I'm like, yes, those are my books from my motherhood class. I need those. but the kids are like, why? You're doing it. I'm like, no, I need help. So leave those where they are.
That's right. Exactly. No, absolutely. Well, it's been a delight, as it always is. And kudos and congrats to you for doing the important work you're doing.
My friends, thank you for joining me in the pod today. Thank you to my guest. Thank you to all the people around the world listening. Keep subscribing, keep sharing, keep sending your feedback. We are just getting started. And thank you to my amazing team led by Stacey Maynard. Extraordinary. Ciao for now. See you soon. Be well.